Thank you, John. Before I get started, I just heard the sad news that the Queen of England has passed, and I want to say that our thoughts are with her family and with the people of the United Kingdom. It's great to be in Dearborn and later today in Detroit. As the global capital of the automobile industry, this region will experience significant growth and many good jobs from the recently enacted Biden economic plan. I'd like to acknowledge Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist for hosting me here in Michigan today. Thank you to Senator Stabenow, whose leadership on many provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act made them a reality, including her critical work on the energy manufacturing tax credit. And I want to thank Senator Peters for his equally strong advocacy and leadership. Thank you also to the members of Congress who are with us here today, Congresswomen Dingell and Stevens and Congressman Levin. I know you've worked very hard over the past few months on historic legislation. My thanks to Mayor Hammoud for being here, and I'm grateful to the leaders at Ford and to the UAW leaders and members for having me here at this cutting-edge EV assembly plant. As Treasury Secretary over the past year and a half, among other things, I've been especially focused on addressing the pandemic-caused crisis. We've been rescuing the job market from the pandemic downturn and stabilizing the economy after its unprecedented disruptions. The pandemic exposed our vulnerabilities, but our economy had long been suffering from soaring inequality, weak growth, and a sense of falling further behind for too many. Sluggish productivity growth and declining labor force participation have weighed down our economic potential. And growing disparities in economic conditions across geographies and racial groups have exacerbated inequality. The pandemic and Putin's immoral war in Ukraine remind us of a vulnerability to global supply shocks. But beyond that, the threat of climate change looms very large. So today, I'd like to step back and describe the administration's efforts to stabilize the economy amid a series of shocks and disruptions. We brought the United States back to full employment in record time. Then I'll discuss the meaning for the future of the historic economic legislation enacted by this administration. Taken together, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act authorize among the most significant investments our country has ever made. I believe firmly they will help us achieve stable, sustainable growth, and they'll move us toward a fairer and more resilient economy. When President Biden took office in January 2021, his immediate focus was to restore the economy while protecting Americans from the threat of a deadly virus. At the time of his inauguration, the pandemic had claimed over 400,000 lives, and 3,000 additional lives were being lost each day. Our public health crisis had triggered an economic calamity. The unemployment rate was over 6%, with more than 800,000 new jobless claims on average every week. It's important to remember the context for the president's actions. At that time, we faced unprecedented uncertainty about the fate of our economy. And the truth is that in 2020 and 2021, the tail risk of the pandemic's impact on our economy was a downturn that could have matched the Great Depression. Our policy response had to sufficiently address all the potential outcomes. So the federal government intervened to keep businesses open, to keep Americans in their homes, and to keep local governments well-resourced. Our plans worked. Due to the American Rescue Plan and our vaccination campaign, the United States experienced the fastest pace of job creation in our history. Household balance sheets are strong, and businesses continue to invest. Our broad and inclusive recovery has outpaced that of most other large economies. And measured by gross domestic income, our economy continues to expand and is operating above levels that would have been predicted pre-pandemic. It's fair to say, by any traditional metric, we have experienced one of the quickest recoveries in our modern history. Now, Americans are rightfully concerned that higher prices are squeezing their day-to-day budgets and their longer-term savings. The causes of inflation are largely global, but the pain of inflation is personal. This administration's top priority is to combat inflation, even as we know the Federal Reserve has the primary role to play in restoring price stability. The President and his entire economic team have focused particularly on our supply chains and energy markets. Last year, when supply chain bottlenecks contributed to upward pressure on prices, the administration worked with partners to recruit more truck drivers, to fund pop-up container yards, and to get several ports on 24/7 operations. We've also released 1 million barrels of oil per day from our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And by Treasury estimates, the President's decision has reduced the price of gas by between around 17 and 42 cents per gallon this year. In markets where we couldn't help lower prices by expanding supply, we aimed to mitigate the pain directly through cost relief. The newly passed Inflation Reduction Act boldly reduces everyday costs for families around the country. Without the law, health care premiums would have spiked for millions of Americans in January. And instead, 13 million Americans will continue to save an average of $800 a year. In coming years, Medicare will be able to negotiate and thereby lower the price of high-cost prescription drugs. And that corrects a market distortion that has placed excessive pricing power in the hands of pharmaceutical companies. So in sum, while costs to American families remain unacceptably high, I believe this administration's actions have made a meaningful difference, and they will continue to do so. As we continue to tackle inflation, President Biden has made clear we cannot just return to the old normal. The recent trifecta of legislation our administration has signed into law will strengthen the foundations of long-term growth at the core of our post-pandemic economy. Earlier this year, I described many of these policies as modern supply-side economics. I described how, prior to the pandemic, higher inequality was accompanied by slower growth. And now, with an economy at full employment, we are uniquely suited for a supply-side expansion that delivers sustainable growth and reduces inequality. Just over half a year after we introduced this concept, the Biden administration has delivered on key aspects of this modern supply-side agenda. And in doing so, we're making a generational investment in the strength of our economy and in the prosperity of our citizens. In particular, I'd like to touch on 3 economic impacts of the newly passed Biden economic plan. They are expanded productive capacity of our economy, increased resilience to global shocks, and greater fairness for workers and businesses. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act, and Inflation Reduction Act will expand the productive capacity of our economy. They will raise the ceiling for what our economy can potentially produce, and they will provide an historic injection of funding into investments that have been too long neglected. Economists have long stressed the importance of basic public infrastructure for economic growth. Yet more than 40,000 bridges, 1 in 5 miles of highway, and major roads in America are in poor condition. Our plan provides the funds to fix roads, ports, bridges, and public transit. People and goods will move faster and with fewer bumps and costly supply chain snarls, such as the ones we've seen during the pandemic. And these improvements will expand output, and they'll enhance the productivity of American workers. Studies show that a 10% increase in government infrastructure investment grows national output by over a percentage point in the long run. Our plan will also bring high-speed internet to unserved and underserved communities across the country. During the pandemic, I heard heartbreaking stories about parents who drove every day to parking lots with Wi-Fi so their children could complete their homework online. With this closing of the digital divide, more children will be able to complete their online schoolwork right at home. The economic opportunities for millions of Americans currently without adequate internet service will be broadened. And regardless of where they live, they will have access to new jobs or customers around the world. Economists have also long underscored the contribution of investments in research and development to American productivity growth. While recent attention on the CHIPS Act has been focused on semiconductor manufacturing, our plan also authorizes tens of billions in federal government investment into research and development across a range of agencies. And this authorization really couldn't come too soon. The United States now ranks 10th in the world in terms of R&D investments as a share of output. Over half a century ago, the federal government spent 1.9% of GDP on R&D. That was partly to fuel the race to the moon. But in recent years, it's spent a third of that. The estimated cost of the retreat in public R&D is $200 billion per year in lost economic output. And meanwhile, competitors in China and the rest of the world are marching forward. The Biden economic plan marks our government's intent to return to serious scientific research and innovation. And you know, I've heard laments of the days when America built and America innovated. And the Biden economic plan provides significant investments in the capacity of the American economy to do just that. The second critical impact of the Biden administration's modern supply-side agenda is to improve American economic resiliency. Americans know the unsettling feeling of seeing empty new car lots or volatile gas prices due to supply shocks beyond our control. Since the private sector doesn't always optimize their supply chain to consider external risks, government has a critical role to play. And we've become too vulnerable to countries like China using their market advantages in certain technologies or natural resources to exercise leverage against other countries for their own benefit. Our plan takes significant steps toward reducing those economic and national security risks. At the same time, we will maintain mutually beneficial trade and keep our deep ties with other countries. This begins with two sectors that are core to 21st century resilience: semiconductors, and energy. While semiconductors are found everywhere in everyday goods, the United States produces only 12% of semiconductors today, and that's down more than a third in the 1990s. The impact of the chip shortage has recently been felt acutely across our economy. Factories have been idled, consumers have faced skyrocketing prices for cars and other goods that rely on chips as a key input. Our plan, which is powered by the CHIPS law, provides around $40 billion in incentives to onshore semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. There will be greater certainty in our increasingly technology-dependent economy. And progress has already been made. A number of semiconductor manufacturers have already announced expansions of their U.S. footprint since the passage of the law. The past few years have also reminded us of our vulnerability to geopolitical and climate-related shocks. These shocks have increased in both frequency and scale, and as I speak here, the southwest of the United States is in a mega drought, an ongoing 22-year drought that is the driest period in over 1,200 years. As part of our plan, the bipartisan infrastructure law allocates around $50 billion toward climate resilience and weatherization. It will protect farmers, homeowners, and communities against the increasing number and scale of droughts, heat waves, and floods. Given the existential threat posed by climate change, it is imperative that we address it. Our plan, powered by the Inflation Reduction Act, represents the largest investment in fighting climate change in our country's history, and it will put us well on our way toward a future where we depend on the wind, the sun, and other clean sources of energy. We will rid ourselves from our current dependence on fossil fuels and the whims of autocrats like Putin. In policy terms, experts estimate this law puts the United States on a path to reducing emissions relative to 2005 levels by approximately 40% within the next 8 years. And that places President Biden's goal of cutting our emissions in half by 2030 well within reach. Now, there is much more work to do, but we can finally say to ourselves and to the world, we are on a path to a net zero emissions economy. I am proud the Treasury is at the forefront of implementing this plan. Today, countries representing around 90% of global GDP have made net zero commitments by mid-century or soon thereafter. By mobilizing private capital, the clean energy tax credits implemented by Treasury will propel our economy and workers to a leadership position in the fastest growing markets and technologies of today and of the future, with positive spillovers to the rest of the world. And this, of course, includes the U.S. clean vehicle sector, where we can expect greater investment and more good jobs like the ones here at Ford as we develop the supply chain here at home. Further, in the process of boosting domestic clean energy production, the law will support our energy security and insulate us from the type of fossil fuel-driven energy volatility we've seen in the past year. I want to end by speaking about fairness in our economy. To me, fairness is a goal of policy. It's also a moral issue. But progress has been elusive. Long before the virus arrived, we were living in an economy where wealth built upon wealth and a growing number of working families and communities were being left behind. The modern supply-side policies I just spoke of are not only pro-growth, they're also pro-fairness. The traditional approach to supply-side economics, which focuses on providing tax incentives to owners of capital in order to boost private investment, that approach in many cases has contributed to deepening income and wealth disparities. And we saw that in the previous administration's signature piece of legislation, a tax bill that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations. In contrast, the modern supply-side agenda is concerned with a broad range of productivity-boosting investments and with a broad distribution across sectors, people, and places. It recognizes that investing in disadvantaged communities often results in higher returns on investment. And it boosts growth by tapping all of our resources. In layman's terms, this approach embraces the notion that some of the best opportunities for growth occur when we invest in people and places that have been forgotten and overlooked. We know that a disproportionate share of economic opportunity has been concentrated in major coastal cities. Investments from the Biden economic plan have already begun shifting this dynamic. Given its manufacturing focus and manufacturing's reliance on strong infrastructure and supply chains, we expect to see dollars catalyze innovative investments across cities and towns that haven't seen such investment in years. As an example, to spur regional economic development, the Commerce Department will establish at least 20 regional technology and innovation hubs, and they will be geographically dispersed with priority for underserved and underrepresented communities. Such dispersal of economic opportunity across the country will mean good new jobs and industries of the future. And it will also lead to cascading economic progress for local communities that are vital to the economic and social fabric of our country. Beyond our growth strategy, the administration is focused on other ways to build fairness in our economy, and that includes fixing the tax system. With the President's leadership, we secured $80 billion of funding for the Internal Revenue Service. That reverses a steep decline over a decade. Billions of dollars will go toward tangible investments, and taxpayers will see that when they interact with the IRS. There will be improved customer service, more answered calls, expedited return processing and refunds, updated computer systems, simplified tax filings. Furthermore, this funding will also help correct a two-tiered tax system by ensuring that large corporations and high-income earners cannot avoid paying the taxes they owe. The tax gap, which is the amount of money that's owed but not paid to the IRS, is huge. It's estimated at $7 trillion over the next decade, and it's disproportionately concentrated among high earners. These earners have more complex and opaque sources of income, and due to the IRS's resource constraints, they're very rarely audited. That means an increased burden in funding our government and investing in our economy falls on working and middle-class families, families that are doing everything right. These resources will enable the IRS to increase audits of taxpayers at the high end and collect taxes from those who have not paid their full bill. And I have made clear this funding will not be used to raise audit rates relative to recent years for households making under $400,000 annually. Rather, with the right technological infrastructure in place, audit rates for those honest taxpayers will actually decline. And this funding will help the IRS collect billions in revenue, which can be used to reduce the deficit, fund additional public investments, or lower taxes for working families. Combined with the corporate tax reforms in the law, this funding also represents some of the most significant steps we have taken in recent years to build a fairer and more effective tax system. So, to summarize, the decisive actions taken by President Biden to vaccinate individuals and control the virus saved countless American lives. And these life-saving measures were accompanied by policies to revive and reinvigorate the economy. Over the past year and a half, the United States has experienced an historic jobs recovery. We've expanded our capacity for sustainable, resilient growth and advanced economic fairness. So where do we go from here? As we look to the fall and the months beyond, our administration is ready to build on the achievements of the past year. The most immediate challenge, of course, is to return to an environment of stable prices without sacrificing the economic gains of the past 2 years. To ensure our long-term economic stability, we must keep our public finances on a sound footing, and we'll build on the momentum of the Inflation Reduction Act's corporate tax reforms to advocate for additional reforms of our tax code and the global tax system, which includes closing loopholes and returning tax rates for high earners and corporations toward historical norms. By making everyone pay their fair share, these reforms will provide our government with additional fiscal room to make critical investments. We'll continue to support sustainable, resilient growth. In the coming months, we expect to see significant movements of private capital into growing industries such as clean energy production and semiconductor fabrication. We'll coordinate permitting reform across the government to speed up these investments while upholding bedrock standards and laws. We also understand the importance of reliable and sustainable sourcing of raw materials and minerals, such as polysilicon, lithium, and cobalt, and iron and steel, as we build the chips, batteries, and infrastructure of the future. We especially understand the urgency of investing in and expanding America's most valuable economic asset, our workforce. Programs like free community college and expanded workforce training increase the productivity of our labor force. And we must invest in structural reforms that increase our labor force participation rate. A large body of research shows that high-quality, affordable childcare and free preschool increase the odds that parents, particularly mothers, will participate in the workforce, and there are lasting benefits for the outcomes of their children. Lastly, we'll continue to pursue economic fairness. The policies I just outlined, from tax reforms to affordable child care, are powerful tools to level the playing field. But there's more, and I believe it's a national imperative to improve the affordability of housing, and that will confer substantial health, social, and economic benefits on low and middle income families. Simply put, it should be easy, not hard, to put a roof over your head. Even as the administration's policies prevented the tsunami of pandemic-related evictions we feared, we must continue advancing our coordinated government approach to expand the supply of housing. For all there's left to do, let me say this. After the progress we've made over the past few months, I am more optimistic about the course of our economy than I have been for quite a while, and I know we're headed in the right direction. Thank you very much.